Okay, it's officially 6 o'clock, so we're gonna move ahead with the webinar. Hello and welcome. My name is Emily Kemp, and I want to welcome you to the webinar about exploring the power of sharing your story. So I kind of want to chat with you a little bit more about where we're going tonight. We'll be discussing kind of the why. Why would someone want to share their stories and some of the implications of sharing their story? We'll talk about the how. So what does that look like? If someone's interested in sharing their story, what does that mean? How do we do that, right? And then we'll talk about some of the benefits, so like the healing qualities of sharing your story, and considerations as well. So sharing your story is a big deal. And for a lot of people, they've never done it before. And it can be really scary and really hard. And so we're going to talk about what that looks like and maybe some ways to keep yourself safe, keep yourself throughout that story sharing process. And then at the very end, we're going to talk more about whatever it is that you want to talk about. So I'm a big believer in kind of steering the conversation where you want it to go. And so I've left a lot of time to answer Q&A. So I want to hear from you. I want to hear your questions. I want to hear your comments. You can do that in a couple of different ways, through the Q&A section or the chat box. So just let me know what you want to learn about, and then we'll go from there. So before we dive in, I want to tell you a little bit more about me and my background. So I am a current student at the University of Montana. I am a master's student, and I am working towards getting my master's in social work. And before I was a master's student, I worked in Bozeman, Montana at a nonprofit called Haven. Haven is a nonprofit that serves the victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And I was their outreach coordinator for about 5 years. So I spearheaded all of our community outreach, education, and prevention efforts. So I've got some pictures here to kind of illustrate a little bit more about what I did. I worked a lot with youth. So I taught teens about healthy relationships, teen dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, healthy boundaries, healthy communication, healthy relationships. And then I empowered them to get out into their community and teach their peers about these topics, which are so important. So really kind of helping them create a peer culture change within their environments, which was an amazing experience. So you see a couple of the pictures there in the middle, in the lower left-hand corner of me working with teens. And then also as part of my job at Haven, I worked with survivors, and I created a program called End the Silence, which was it was born out of a focus group that was held with survivors, where survivors were talking about how they felt like they needed to share their story, but that they weren't allowed to share their story. And that they really wanted to get out in the community and educate people, but they didn't feel like that had ever happened before, and so they didn't know where to start. And so my job was to work with them in creating a program where they did get out into the community and share their story. So that looked a lot of different ways. Sometimes it was, big keynote addresses. So that bottom right-hand photo is a group that shared at a very formal event in front of, multiple hundreds of people. But it could also be workshops. So in that upper right-hand corner, that's a picture of a workshop that we held together where survivors were getting out in the community and really teaching about domestic violence through a first-person narrative. And that was an incredibly powerful experience, an amazing program. And that is actually how I met Stevie Croissant, who is the founder of We Are Her. So she was a part of that group. I think she was the second group who ever went through the program. And because of that, we connected. And when she started her own group, an own organization, We Are Her, she ended up asking me to be the host of a podcast for her organization, the We Are Her podcast. So I did that, and there's couple of photos there of the podcast cover and, me in action talking with survivors. That was an amazing experience. And now I am the We Are Her programming and outreach intern. As I am working towards my degree, I get to now be involved. I get school credit for it. So it's a win-win situation. It's amazing. So I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit more about me and my credentials. So from here, I want to talk about the why. Like, why would someone want to share their story? And what are the implications of story sharing, especially around issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, childhood sexual abuse? And I did actually want to touch on the fact that while this webinar is designed for that, I do think that a lot of the content of this webinar is applicable to a lot of different types of trauma and oppression. So whether you are a survivor or not, hopefully there are some tidbits in here that you can carry on with you into your world, into your life, into whatever work that you're doing. So back to the why. Domestic violence, sexual assault, childhood sexual abuse are an epidemic. I have some stats here. You'll see me looking down. I'm gonna read them off this paper. But according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 20 people a minute are abused by an intimate partner, which equates to about 10 million women and men over a year, which is a huge number of people. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 70 men in the United States have been raped in their lifetime. 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence in a year. And then according to RAINN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, 1 in 9 girls and 1 in 53 boys under 18 experience sexual abuse or assault at the hands of an adult. And I also feel like it's really important to mention that as staggering as those statistics are, there are demographics and groups of people in our society who experience these types of violences at a much higher rate. So, folks in the LGBTQ community experience these at a higher rate. Women of color, especially Indigenous women, experience these types of abuses at a much higher rate. And the reason that I mention these statistics is because I want survivors to know that they're not alone. And these are issues that we have traditionally skirted around as a society. And yet, when you look at the numbers, they're pretty overwhelming. So if you have ever experienced any of these types of violences, you are not alone. And that's a big reason to share, right? Because if you've experienced it, someone probably has, and there's room there for connection. There's room there for story sharing. Part of the reason why abuse continues is because it thrives in the shadows. Abusers are constantly conditioning their victims to never speak out. They're telling them they're crazy, they're threatening them with violence if they speak out, and then either in or out of the relationship, a lot of people and victims more specifically are not believed. Or if they're on the other side of their experience, people get very uncomfortable. They say, well, I don't really want to hear about that. You need to stay silent. So victims and survivors are receiving these messages from multiple places that they just should not talk about this. And yet we know how pervasive the issue is. And so it feels like something that we should be talking about a lot more. Another why or implication of sharing your story is the way in which it can educate others. It can educate the community.
You can just post
when you share from your first person perspective, it often can bring someone into a whole new world of understanding around these issues that they never could have otherwise. Most of us learn about these issues by, reading it in a book or reading stats on a website, and so there's really a lot of room there, I think, for people to connect and resonate with this issue on a much, much deeper level. And that kind of moves into my next point, which is sharing reduces shame and stigma. I think it reduces the shame and stigma that survivors themselves feel about their own experience. And I think that it helps reduce the shame and stigma that other people who maybe never encountered this issue before kind of feel about survivors, because they other survivors and they just don't understand it. So I think the more that we can connect over this issue and share, the more it reduces that shame and stigma. And then lastly, and this is a term that I use a lot, I think anytime you share your story, you are giving somebody the gift of going second. And I think we can see that in the Me Too movement, especially, where, you know, someone in a prominent power position shares their experience with these issues, and then all of a sudden people are just chomping at the bit to connect and to say, me too, I have also experienced these things. So I really believe in, you know, trying to challenge ourselves to be brave and to give someone else the opportunity to say, me too. So next, I kind of want to talk about the how, and this is a big, I think, kind of scary point of contention for a lot of survivors. How do I do this? I feel like this need to share my story, but I don't really know how to do that. And so I think it's important to start by saying that sharing your story doesn't have to be for anyone else. It can be just for yourself. I think a lot of people, when they think of story sharing, they think of something like a speak out or standing up at, you know, a Take Back the Night event, or, you know, in front of this huge audience. And it doesn't have to be. It can be so personal. It can be just for yourself. So one place you might want to start, if you're not experienced or, you know, have never shared your story before, is just writing in a journal. It really is so intimate, and it really helps you understand your own mind and just kind of put whatever it is that you're feeling out on paper. It's a really safe way to express yourself, because it's just you and your pen and your paper. So try writing in a journal first, if that feels like kind of a more progressive step towards talking with somebody else about it. I also think that sharing with a trained professional can be really important. And, you know, there's so much value in therapy. Therapy can be a really great way to process out loud with a trained professional who knows how to support your healing. Especially if you feel like you are new to sharing, or you might be experiencing symptoms of the trauma that you've experienced from the abuse or assault that you've suffered from. Really connecting with a therapist can be a huge first step. And again, they really know how to kind of hold that space for you in a very safe way. I also think that connecting with your local domestic violence organization, which usually also serves sexual assault, child abuse, most DV organizations kind of encompass a lot of those issues. And I think that connecting with those organizations can provide you opportunities to connect with a trained advocate. If you just, you know, need someone to talk to at 3 in the morning on that support line. Sometimes they have programs that are specifically designed for you to talk with other survivors, just like End the Silence, just like the program that we had at Haven and Bozeman. And most of them also have support groups. And so those specific groups are for survivors who are looking to connect with other survivors in a very safe environment. And so those support are generally led by a trained counselor who can kind of hold that space for the group. So that's an amazing step in the right direction. Connect with your local domestic violence organization. You can also share with a safe person in your life, somebody like a partner, a friend, a family member. It doesn't, again, have to be in these large crowded spaces. Sharing with a safe person can be incredibly validating. And There are so many different ways for you to share. So I think that's a great first step. Within the We Are Her community, there are a ton of different ways for you to share your story. So that's a huge part of the We Are Her mission, is to figure out ways for survivors to get connected with other survivors and to really feel like they are able to express themselves and what they've been through. So within that We Are Her community, there are a lot of different options. You can write for the We Are Her blog, and that is 100% confidential, and it's a really safe way to kind of write something and just put it out there for other people to read. You're completely in control of what you're saying, what you're writing, what you're putting out into the world, and so that again is just super, super safe and maybe a little bit more comfortable for some people than having to sit down in person with another human and kind of say out loud what you've been through. So think about the We Are Her blog. We also have takeovers. We call them survivor takeovers, and they are through our social media accounts on Instagram, on Facebook, and that is a great way for survivors to, again, be totally in control of the content that they put out, but also not have to be around other people, maybe be in the safety of their own home with whatever safety and support mechanisms they have around them, and put it out to a community who cares deeply about these issues. I think, from the experience that I've seen with We Are Her, anybody who shares on We Are Her is so well received and so supported. And I think that can be a really validating experience in and of itself. If you are really worried about sharing your story and then somebody else, once you have shared, is so supportive and so validating, it can make you feel, not crazy. It can make you feel like you're not alone. And I think that platform can do amazing things in terms of that. We've got a few other opportunities, including a survivor meetup, a virtual survivor meetup, actually. So about once a month, We Are Her kind of sends out the all call for any survivor who is interested in connecting with other survivors in a small group Zoom meeting. And we've done it a few times now. They've been super successful and really powerful. I think, the idea of like having to get in your car and drive to a physical space and hash out all your stuff with somebody else can be really scary and really intimidating. But these virtual survivor meetups are so cool, and they're so accessible, and you can be in your bathrobe and laying in your bed and just kind of zoom in and connect with other survivors. And these meetups have I've seen other survivors like connect so much with people in the group that they buy a plane ticket and go out and visit them in the future. So again, just a really great opportunity. So follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and we try to put those opportunities out there for people whenever we have them available. Again, about once a month for those meetups. So huge support system there. Another really cool thing that We Are Her is doing is trying to pilot in-person chapters. And right now we're calling them Her Out Loud. We've done a couple of them in Bozeman, Montana already, where Stevie is, and she's kind of headquartered there. And the Her Out Loud community, you can kind of see in the lower right-hand corner there, is really about survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual abuse, to find and connect with other survivors. It's not a support group in that it's not led by, that counselor, that therapist. It's not about group processing, yada, yada. It's really just about connecting with other survivors in a meaningful way. And I think that can provide so much healing. Like counseling, support groups, those kind of structured spaces where you're able to process are incredibly important, but so is just being around other people who know what you've been through. And without you having to explain yourself, without you having to feel ashamed, embarrassed, you can just be around people who get it. And so we're definitely trying to pilot those. If you ever feel like you are interested in starting one of those in your own community, please message us, because we are trying to help people get those off the ground. So those are the Her Out Loud chapters. We've also got a podcast. We have had an incredibly successful first season. We're about to record the second season, and I don't see us stopping anytime soon. So if typing out your story and sharing it in word format feels really overwhelming or scary, you can always apply to be in future seasons of the podcast. So I also think that listening and hearing other survivors share their stories on the podcast can be incredibly powerful and beneficial too. So tap into that. I think it's a great resource. And if you ever feel inspired to want to talk about your story, then just message us, apply. We would love to have you. And the last kind of newest thing that we've got going on at We Are Her is our We Are Her chat option on the website. So myself, a trained advocate, will be kind of on the other line of this chat option. And if you go to weareher.net, in the lower right-hand corner of the website, you will see two different options. You'll see a little envelope, and the envelope means that I'm offline, but you can email me and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And then if it says we're here, then I'm live and we can chat live together in a little chat box. So all of these options at We Are Her are pretty amazing to get connected, to put your story out there, to connect with other survivors. So hopefully some of those kind of stand out to you, maybe feel like something you'd be interested in. If you have any questions about them, please just reach out and we'd be happy to chat with you more about them. So those are just a handful of options on how you might try to start sharing your story. And from here, I want to talk about, what that can do. Some of those healing benefits of sharing your story with other people. I've got my notes here because this is really important, so I don't want to mess it up. The first point that I have here in the webinar is this idea of empowerment, and that sharing your story really can help you take back your own experience and use your voice. And for anyone who's experienced any kind of abuse or assault, I think you probably know deep down that a part of that experience has been that whoever was enacting that violence against you didn't want you to talk about it, right? So being able to talk about it can be this like kind of reclamation of your experience and be an incredibly empowering moment in healing. So empowerment is huge, and once you feel empowered, I feel like there's a whole lot more space to heal and to kind of engage in new and different ways than maybe you were too afraid to before. So empowerment is huge. Healing with others. Okay, so this is a really interesting idea that I just like so much. This is not my own idea. I had someone talk to me about this at one time about how interpersonal violence happens with another human being. And so sometimes what can be most healing is if you are healing also with another human being. That isolation can make it way, way, way worse. So it's a really interesting sort of like yin and yang of the two different experiences. That yes, the violence happened with another person or other people, and then somehow by being able to heal with another person or other people, it can sort of create this complementary experience that can just support healing in a whole new way. And I thought that was a really interesting concept that's always stuck with me. So healing with others can be a big part of sharing your story. Language is powerful. So actually speaking out loud and saying, your experience through words, to another person about what has happened to you can be really, really powerful. So putting words around our experiences helps us process them, number one. And I think it also helps us get out of like the hamster wheel in our own head. And I use the hamster wheel analogy a lot because I have experienced that personally, where I'm thinking over and over and over again, kind of in my head through the same sort of circular thought pattern. And if I can say something out loud and put language around it and kind of give it to another person, it helps me get outside of my head and get a whole bunch of new insights. So language is really, really powerful. along those same lines, I think that sharing with another person can provide insight into your own experiences, and it can act as like a mirror or sounding board for you. So this is kind of the process that I think about when I think about sharing with another person. So you have to form your thought, and then you have to put it into words. Then you share it with someone else. That story is received by someone else, and then they can reflect or mirror back what you have just said to them, so that you can hear your own self think out loud through another person. And that is an incredibly cathartic experience. So sharing with people, it's great to get us out of our own little schemas. I also think connection and intimacy can be a corrective experience. So by corrective, what I mean is that the dichotomy of being in an abusive relationship is that you are on the receiving end of like not only pain, suffering, abuse, but you are engaged in a dichotomy of like it's like intrinsically unsafe, right? It's not healthy, it's not good, it doesn't serve you, it's harmful. And then if on the flip side of that, if you can connect with someone, share with them, and have that be safe, healthy, and supportive, it can show you what relationships can be, how good they can be, how supportive they can be. And so it sort of shows you again that sort of yin and yang, that flip side, that there's an alternative, that not all relationships have to be unsafe. They don't have to be harmful. They don't have to be abusive. You can engage with people in really supportive ways. And that vulnerability is huge. I also think that sharing stories with people can build community. So again, kind of going back to that idea of like the gift of going second, right? If you've been through this experience, there's probably a lot of other people who've been through this experience. And so the more you share with folks, the more you can really
it's so funny how you
build this like this tribe, this sense of supportive community, and that in and of itself can be incredibly healing. And the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of benefits, or kind of like the healing properties of sharing your story, is this idea that I just heard this last week, actually, in a virtual survivor meetup with We Are Her. One of the survivors said that when she started sharing her story, it made her feel not crazy, that what happened to her was real. And her abuser, her perpetrator, really tried to make her feel like it was all in her head. And so now on the flip side, the more she can talk about it, the more she can say out loud what actually happened to her, it makes her feel like, no, I'm not crazy. This was real. This actually happened to me. I didn't deserve it. And that's a huge part of healing, especially when you share that with someone else, it's received, and that person says, me too, you're not crazy, I've been through the same thing, or no, you're not crazy, like what you went through was totally legitimate and you have every right to feel hurt and upset. And so yeah, I think that can be an incredibly important step along the way of healing. From here, I do want to talk about considerations, right? Because sharing your story it's a lot. It can be a lot for you, it can be a lot for other people. And so sort of talking through how to make this as safe an experience for you as possible. I want to start by saying, number one, sharing is not an obligation. You never have to share your story. If you're not ready, or don't want to share your story right now, or don't want to share your story ever, you do not have to. And if you try and force yourself to do that before you're ready, it can actually be a pretty re-traumatizing experience. I'm going to take this webinar in a little bit of a personal direction, and I sort of debated around like, how do I incorporate this into the webinar? Do I give it its own slide, or do I address it if it comes up naturally in Q&A? But I thought it's important for me to mention that I am actually a childhood sexual abuse survivor, and I don't talk about it really ever with very many people. I've never talked about it in detail with anyone. And so at times I do feel like a little bit of a hypocrite, like, oh, how can I be telling people you know, the power of sharing their story if I can't do it myself. And I have to kind of stop myself and say, like, no, I have a right to not share my story, and I have a right to not share that if it's not safe or it doesn't feel comfortable for me. And so I can't stress that enough. Please don't feel like you have to do that. If you do have that desire to share your story, then amazing. And I think there's so many survivors who are on that same page. So the next thing I kind of want to address is this idea that sharing your story can be triggering. It's really hard to talk about what you've been through and sort of share those experiences without it bringing, without it bringing the trauma back up again, right? And so I highly suggest that people create an emotional safety plan. Something to support you if you do get triggered when you're sharing. And that can look like, and I have some ideas here that I might share with you. I've got counseling, meditation, yoga, exercise, art or art therapy, pets. My dog is my savior. Supportive relationships to fall back on, like a partner, family member, or friend. But whatever that looks like to you, kind of thinking ahead and putting those support systems in place for you. Because again, it can bring things back to the surface, and that can hurt, and it might cause nightmares, it might cause some PTSD reactions. And so yeah, really being safe with yourself and nurturing yourself and doing what you need to do if you do want to share is important. So this idea of context, and that context matters. I want to touch on that too. So if and when you share your story, you are in control of who you share your story to, what you say, when you say it, where you say it, and like what circumstances you say it under. And that's really important because I think we sort of assume that if you share your story once, you want to share it forever. And that's not necessarily true. You don't have to universally kind of spread your story far and wide. You don't have to share with anyone or under any circumstances that you don't want to. You should be in complete control of how you do that.
Library up here.
What I want to touch on next is that in this process of story sharing, it can, once you start kind of talking about your story out loud, there might be moments where you share something and then you realize, oh my gosh, I didn't actually want to share that, or oops, that was really triggering, or shoot, now I'm super uncomfortable, sharing those particular details. And that's okay. It's really, a very natural part of the process. And that is when that emotional safety plan comes into play. That's when it is important that you fall back on the system of support that you've already put in place for yourself. But I think it's easy to kind of beat ourselves up around when that happens. Like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I can't believe I said that. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. And it's a learning process, right? It can be a little bit messy, and that's 100% okay. I also want to talk about how, if and when you do decide to share, people will also say me too, right? We've definitely seen that in our society, in our culture, and that's really beautiful. It can be incredibly powerful and incredibly healing, but also if it becomes too much, if it's overwhelming, or people are sharing things that you don't want to receive, you have a right to maintain your boundaries. And so I highly recommend getting in touch with, again, your local DV resources, or looking up online some basic advocacy skills, so that if someone does share something with you that you're uncomfortable with, you can help support this person in their journey, but also take care of yourself. And so, yeah, you can always refer them to We Are Her. Again, like I mentioned in previous slides, we've got a lot of different outlets and resources for survivors if they need that support. You can refer them to your local DV resource. There's also a national hotline. And so, yeah, being able to say, like, that's too much for me, but hey, I really care about you, and here's an organization that can receive you, is an important step in your own kind of boundary making around sharing your story with other people. So from here, I kind of want to stop talking at you and start fielding some questions. I would love to hear from you, participants, and tell me kind of what you're thinking. What are your questions? What are your comments? What are your concerns? Type into the Q&A. Anybody has any questions? Cool. Okay. Well, I just want to tell everyone thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar. Oh, hold on. Here we go. Okay, so here we go. Thank you for all you shared. As a survivor of child abuse and emotional abuse in my marriage, how can we share our part of the story without hurting those involved? I'm afraid to share parts of my story due to being divorced and co-parenting. Oof, yeah, that is a great question. I think you just kind of have to check in with yourself and really understand where your boundaries around sharing are, and that can include harm to others. And if you feel like, and I've seen it go a couple of different ways, right? Like I've seen people say like, oh, if I share this, it might hurt the other person, but you know what, that's fine because this is my truth and I need to share it. I also think when there are kids involved and there are things like divorce involved, it can make it a lot more complicated, and that is, you know, cause for reevaluating your boundaries. Like, what do I, is that going to hurt you? Is that going to come back on you in some sort of way? And is it going to make the whole situation that you're living in a lot more complicated, a lot more painful? So I think those are great questions, and I hate to like kind of put it back on you and be like, well, you have to figure it out. But I also do think that, you know your situation better than anyone, and you have the wisdom within you to decide what is the best route for you to take. And if it feels like, when you weigh the pros and cons, that sharing your story is too important, that is like a really important step in your healing process, then you have the right to do that. And I've seen, you know, survivors share in very public forums about their situation and have chosen to do that despite the fact that it might kind of come around and bite them in the butt at some point. But there are ways that you can do that more carefully in terms of like omitting names and making things more general. The We Are Her blog is an amazing way to share your story confidentially, because your name isn't named. You can change the names and specifics of events, dates, people, and still be able to kind of truthfully hold the integrity of your story and kind of put it out there for other people to read and be received. So there's, yeah, I think you asked a really great, complicated question, and sometimes you have to get creative, but if it doesn't feel safe for you, then that's totally fair. Great question. Okay, so I have another question from somebody that says, I can't share my story without fight or flight taking over and making me shake really badly. Does that ever go away? I can't necessarily speak to that personally because I choose not to share my story, in large part because of that reason, because my sort of survival instincts take over in a way that makes me feel too afraid, too uncomfortable. And I think that type of nervous system reaction is information for us. I don't necessarily think that you have to wait for that feeling to go away to ever be able to share. Because I know for some people, that feeling doesn't ever necessarily go away. It might ebb and flow. It's all on a spectrum. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. But I do think that you have to be able to kind of check in with yourself and assess kind of whether that reaction is too much of an impediment or if it's something that you're willing to kind of hold space for and continue to share your story anyway. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, I also want to kind of affirm that that reaction, that fight or flight reaction, that nervous system response is 100% normal, right? Because when you're sort of sharing your story, when you're thinking about it, the body can very much sort of relive that experience and starts putting you into a space of like, hey, we're in danger. This isn't okay. Yeah, does it ever get better? I do think so. I do think so. In my experience, not necessarily sharing my own personal story because I'm not quite there yet, but at least in what I've heard from other survivors in their own journey with sharing their story, I do think that I've seen survivors get much more comfortable, much more confident, that nervous system response sort of starts to settle the more and more that they do it. It's a bit like exposure therapy, if that makes sense. Okay, I have another question here that says, how did you first share? Well, I haven't really yet, so that's a great question. I'm not quite there yet. I'm inching closer to it, little bit by little bit, but I've just recently become comfortable sort of giving myself labels and titles and saying that out loud to strangers and friends, and yeah, I'm not there yet. And sometimes I feel like, oh, I should be, or how can I be sort of supporting people in their journey with sharing their story if I can't do it? But I don't think it's helpful to compare, and we're at where we're at, and that's okay. So I'm sort of just trying to respect my journey, and sometime in the future, maybe I will. Maybe I won't. Who knows? It's okay either way. So great question. Ooh, we've got a few more. Let's see. How often do you get survivors that share their story in whatever form, but don't remember a lot of it? In my case, alcohol was involved and I don't remember much. And sometimes that makes me wonder, if it's worth sharing? Yeah, what we know about trauma is that when the brain is in that survival mode, which is fight, flight, or freeze, or there's a fourth response that is being researched and recently sort of incorporated into fight, flight, or freeze, which is called appease, or feign, which is the response of kind of like buddying up to or appeasing the person who's enacting violence on you in order to stay safe. And I think that that's a really important survival response that we don't talk about enough. So yeah, fight, flight, freeze, or appease. When our brain is in that state, our prefrontal cortex, which is the rational thinking part of our brain, shuts down. And that impacts our memory, that impacts our ability to process. And so it's very common for people who've experienced trauma to not be able to remember their experiences, or it might come back in flashbacks, or it might come back in bits and pieces, or 20 years later, all of a sudden it comes up in a dream, or you just remember something kind of out of the blue. So that's really common regardless of alcohol or not. And regardless of any kind of, and this is really important and I want to make this point, regardless of any kind of substance abuse, regardless of any kind of alcohol involvement, it doesn't matter. You are never, you should never experience abuse. I think we have these myths around alcohol and substance abuse that somehow they excuse the violence or they explain the violence, but substance abuse is not a cause for any kind of domestic violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse. It can exacerbate issues, it can make them worse, but it's not it's not like a causation relationship. So there are a lot of abusers who perpetrate violence when they're not under the substance or under the influence of substances. And so it can often be used as an excuse for their actions. And again, even if the victim was under the influence of substances, that does not excuse any kind of violence that's perpetrated against them. And so I think that's a really common myth in our society, and it makes it really hard for victims to report or to want to talk about it, because it makes it that much easier for people who don't understand the situation to blame them for the violence that's happened to them because of substances, or oh well, you were drunk, or oh you guys were using, or oh there was something else involved. But regardless, no one ever deserves to be treated with disrespect, to be treated with violence, to have violence perpetrated against them. It's not an excuse. And so I think if you're experiencing that kind of resistance against sharing your story because maybe people won't believe me, I think there are probably a lot of other people in a similar boat. Yeah, which doesn't make it right, but I think it's an important part to talk about. Let's see, I'm gonna check in, see if there are any other questions. I'm still new to this too, so sorry everyone if I'm like very clumsy and cumbersome. Oh, okay. Here we go. If anybody has any other questions, I would love to hear them. Okay. Doesn't look like we have anything else coming in. So we'll end here. And if you have any more questions, concerns, comments, please reach out to us via the website, via our social media, via email. We would love to hear from you. We can always chat more in the future. So this is not goodbye. This is I'll see you later. And thank you everybody for tuning into the webinar. Hopefully you found it helpful. And have a good night. Take care of yourself. And we'll see you again. I'm all over We Are Her, so I'm sure you'll see my face again. I look forward to connecting with everybody. Goodbye. Ooh, I'm trying to stop this. There we go.